In the space of a single night, the United States military turned more than 80 locations across Iran into craters, and by the time most of the world woke up to the news, the fragile peace everyone had been quietly hoping would hold was already lying in pieces somewhere off the coast of Oman. Before I walk you through what actually happened, tell me where you're tuning in from, drop it below, because I genuinely want to know how far this story is traveling right now, and this is one of those nights where it matters. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's a sequence of events that unfolded over roughly 24 hours, and once you see how the pieces fit together, you'll understand why so many people who study this region are suddenly a lot less calm than they were 48 hours ago. Let's start with the spark, because everything that followed traces back to a handful of missiles fired in the dark. Late on Tuesday, 3 commercial vessels were struck while attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, arguably the single most important choke point for global energy on the entire planet. A Qatari-owned liquefied natural gas tanker, the Al Rekayat, took a direct hit and caught fire in its engine room. A blaze severe enough that crews on board genuinely feared the ship could explode beneath them. A Saudi-flagged supertanker called the Wedian was struck as well. Within hours, a 3rd vessel was hit in the same stretch of water. Qatar didn't hesitate, publicly naming Iran as responsible. Iranian state media didn't officially claim the attack, but the language coming out of Tehran read less like a denial and more like a wink, the kind of ambiguous phrasing regimes use when they want the message understood without ever putting their fingerprints directly on it. Within hours, the United States Treasury Department moved first, revoking a sanctions waiver that had been quietly allowing Iran to keep selling oil under the terms of a ceasefire signed only weeks earlier. And then, in the early hours of Wednesday, United States Central Command announced it had launched what it called a series of powerful strikes against Iran, hammering more than 80 targets with precision munitions in a single coordinated operation. Air defense batteries, command and control networks, coastal radar stations, anti-ship missile sites, more than 60 small boats belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the exact force accused of carrying out the tanker attacks that triggered all of this in the first place. This was not a symbolic gesture designed to save face. This was a sweeping, deliberate campaign meant to physically strip away Iran's ability to threaten that waterway again anytime soon. And it happened close enough to the strait that global oil markets barely had time to process the first headline before the second one landed. Saudi Arabia, whose own tanker had just been set upon in international waters, wasn't shy about condemning the attack either, calling the strike on the Wedian an assault not just on a single ship, but on the broader security of international navigation and the stability of the world's energy supply chain. And American officials, when pressed for justification, didn't dance around the reasoning. A senior official put it plainly, stating that the ceasefire arrangement with Iran had always been conditional from day one, that Tehran would only continue to reap its benefits if it demonstrated what was described as good behavior, and that this latest assault on commercial shipping crossed a line that could not be met with silence. In other words, Washington wasn't apologizing for the scale of the response. You have to understand that none of this is happening in a vacuum. It's the second act of a war that a lot of people were told had already ended. Rewind to February of this year. Somewhere in the middle of that campaign, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the single most powerful and symbolically important figure inside the Islamic Republic for more than 3 decades, was killed. Think about what that actually means for a country built almost entirely around the authority of that office. It wasn't just the loss of a leader. It was the sudden, violent removal of the figure the entire theocratic system had been organized around since 1989. In retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard did the one thing it still had the power to do. It shut the Strait of Hormuz down completely, laying sea mines across shipping lanes, boarding and seizing merchant vessels, and declaring flatly that any ship connected to the United States, Israel, or their allies moving in or out of the strait would not be permitted through. Before that closure, something close to a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and roughly a fifth of its liquefied natural gas moved through that single waterway every single day. The International Maritime Organization later reported that at the peak of the crisis, something like 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were stranded across the Persian Gulf with absolutely nowhere to go. Ordinary sailors from dozens of nations, trapped in the middle of an active war zone. They had no stake in whatsoever. Some of them later describing missiles screaming overhead and explosions lighting up the water beside their own vessels, while they simply waited, terrified, for someone somewhere to negotiate them a way out. The economic fallout of that closure rippled across the entire planet. Oil prices spiked hard. Inflation, which had only just begun cooling down in major economies, came roaring back. And in one of those grim ironies that tends to define modern conflict, the 2 countries that ended up profiting the most from the entire crisis were the United States and Russia, the 2 nations furthest removed from the strait itself. together pulling in tens of billions of dollars in additional export revenue, while nearly every Gulf state that actually depended on that waterway watched its own income shrink in real time. Saudi Arabia and Oman managed to soften the blow slightly through alternative pipeline and coastal routes that bypassed the strait entirely. Iran, remarkably, managed to keep some of its own exports flowing even while strangling everyone else's. A reminder that in this particular conflict, the party doing the blockading still had options the party being blockaded simply didn't. Eventually, after months of standoff, punishing economic pressure, and enormous diplomatic effort, Washington and Tehran reached an uneasy truce, a memorandum of understanding signed last month that formally ended the active fighting and reopened the strait to commercial shipping. But if you actually read the fine print of how that agreement was constructed, the warning signs were sitting right there in plain language. American officials described the deal from the very beginning as entirely performance-based, meaning every benefit extended to Iran, including its ability to legally sell oil again, was conditional and revocable at a moment's notice. That is not the architecture of a durable peace. That is the architecture of a pause everyone quietly understood could collapse the instant something went wrong. And it very nearly did collapse once already, weeks before this latest round, when a similar pattern of Iranian attacks on shipping triggered a previous wave of American retaliation, an exchange that itself pulled in Iranian strikes against American positions in Bahrain and Kuwait. So what unfolded this week wasn't some unprecedented shock arriving out of a clear blue sky. It was the second time in a matter of weeks that this exact same sequence has played out from start to finish. Ships get struck in the strait, Washington answers with overwhelming force, and the entire region holds its breath waiting to see whether the ceasefire survives another round of it. Now here's where things get genuinely dangerous, because Iran did not sit quietly and absorb this latest wave of American strikes. Tehran claims it targeted more than 80 American military facilities spread across Bahrain and Kuwait in direct response. And if that figure is anywhere close to accurate, it represents a scale of retaliation that goes far beyond a token, face-saving gesture. And the backdrop inside Iran right now could not be more volatile. All of this is unfolding in the middle of a week-long state funeral procession for Khamenei, the very leader, killed back in February, with mourners across the country openly and publicly chanting for revenge, some of them carrying signs and calling out by name for the deaths of both the American president and the Israeli prime minister. That is not the atmosphere of a nation quietly searching for an off-ramp. That is the atmosphere of a grieving, humiliated population and a fractured leadership structure under enormous internal pressure to answer strength with strength, restraint be damned. Layer onto that the fact that Iran has spent recent weeks insisting that ships can only safely transit the strait using one specific Tehran-approved route, one that requires vessels to register directly with Iranian authorities, an assertion of control over international waters that no single nation has any legal standing to claim. The 3 vessels struck this week were reportedly using a different route closer to the Omani coastline, precisely the route international maritime authorities had assured commercial shippers was safe and fully available. Whether that routing dispute was the actual trigger for the attack, or simply the pretext, is something we may never get a fully clean answer to. But it tells you the reopened strait was never genuinely stabilized in the first place. It was more like a pressure valve someone was holding shut by hand, waiting for the moment their grip slipped. What makes this entire sequence even harder to read is where the President of the United States physically was when the order to strike went out. Trump wasn't in the Situation Room. He was thousands of miles away in Ankara, sitting beside Turkish President Erdogan at a NATO leaders summit, in the middle of announcing an entirely separate, equally consequential shift in American policy toward Turkey, one involving the lifting of sanctions and the possible return of advanced fighter jets. 2 enormous, history-shifting stories unfolding in parallel on the exact same day, in 2 completely different corners of the world, both ultimately circling back to the same underlying question: how far is Washington willing to go, and how many relationships is it willing to reshape, to hold together a region that increasingly refuses to stay settled? At that same summit, Trump made a point of publicly praising Turkey for staying out of the Iran conflict entirely, telling reporters that Ankara could easily have aligned with Tehran to strike at Israel but chose not to, adding, with characteristic bluntness, that maybe they didn't do that because of him, personally. Whether or not that's an accurate read of Turkish decision-making, it tells you exactly how the president himself is narrating this entire moment as a story about personal relationships and personal leverage, holding together an increasingly unstable region, even as American warplanes were in the skies over Iran during that very same set of hours. So let's break this apart properly, because there isn't one storyline here, there are several, and every single one of them is colliding at the exact same moment. The first angle is the economic one, and it's the angle that touches the largest number of people who have never given the Strait of Hormuz a second thought in their entire lives. Every single time this waterway comes under threat, global oil markets react almost instantly, And this week was no exception, with crude prices jumping the moment news of the strikes broke, before the smoke over Iran had even had time to clear. Insurers, for what it's worth, had already been quietly raising the cost of covering vessels transiting the strait in the days leading up to this latest attack. War risk premiums climbing sharply enough that a single transit for the largest crude carriers could now cost several $100,000 more than it did just weeks earlier. That's not an abstract detail buried in a financial filing somewhere. That's the market itself pricing, in the expectation that something like this was coming, well before it actually happened, which tells you the people whose entire job is quantifying risk in this region had already concluded the ceasefire was far more fragile than the diplomatic language surrounding it ever let on. The second angle is Iran's internal politics, and it may end up being the most important variable in the entire equation. Whatever decision-making structure authorized these tanker attacks is operating inside a country that just lost the single most powerful figure in its modern political history to an American and Israeli strike, and is, quite literally, in the middle of burying him this week. Regimes under that kind of compounded pressure don't always behave the way outside analysts expect them to. Sometimes internal weakness produces caution and a desire to avoid further losses. Sometimes it produces the exact opposite, an urgent need to project strength outward specifically because everything at home feels like it's cracking. The chants calling for revenge echoing through Khamenei's funeral procession aren't just grief, they're a live signal of the political current that whatever leadership remains in Tehran now has to navigate. And right now, that current is pointed unmistakably toward further escalation, not away from it. The third angle is the credibility of the ceasefire framework itself, and this one matters enormously for anyone trying to map out where this actually goes from here. A deal explicitly structured as entirely performance-based, contingent on continuous good behavior, with no meaningful enforcement mechanism beyond the constant threat of renewed strikes, is inherently unstable by design. It essentially guarantees that any single incident, whether ordered directly out of Tehran, carried out by a rogue Revolutionary Guard commander acting without full authorization, or even something neither side fully intended, has the raw power to blow the entire arrangement apart overnight. We've now watched that exact dynamic play out twice within a matter of weeks. That is not a coincidence. That is a structural flaw baked directly into the foundation of how this truce was built from the very beginning. And structural flaws like that tend not to fix themselves. They tend to get exposed again and again until something finally breaks for good. The fourth angle ties everything together, and it's the question of what the United States is genuinely trying to accomplish here, beyond simply answering provocation with force. Revoking the oil sanctions waiver wasn't a symbolic afterthought. It was a direct hit to the one meaningful economic lifeline that had been extended to Iran as an incentive to keep behaving. Pair that with a strike package specifically targeting radar installations, anti-ship missile batteries, and the exact naval forces responsible for the tanker attacks in the first place. And what you're looking at isn't just retaliation for retaliation's sake. It's a deliberate attempt to systematically strip away Iran's near-term ability to threaten that waterway ever again. Whether that strategy actually succeeds, or whether it simply convinces an already wounded, humiliated government in Tehran that it has nothing left to lose by escalating even further, is arguably the single biggest open question hanging over this entire crisis right now. There's a version of this where degrading those capabilities buys real quiet, where a weakened Revolutionary Guard simply lacks the physical means to strike shipping again for weeks or months, creating enough breathing room for diplomats to negotiate something sturdier than a truce that can collapse overnight. But there's another version too, one military planners have to take just as seriously, where a regime, already reeling from the loss of its supreme leader, interprets renewed American strikes not as a deterrent at all, but as proof that de-escalation was never genuinely on the table to begin with, and responds accordingly, not with caution, but with whatever capability it still has left to make the cost of continued conflict as unbearable as possible for everyone else sharing that region with it. There's a fifth angle too, one that rarely gets discussed with the seriousness it deserves, and that's the question of what this does to every other country whose ships pass through that strait without ever being part of the actual fight. Indian sailors, Filipino crews, European shipping companies, insurers based in London, refineries scattered across half a dozen continents, none of them chose this conflict. And yet all of them are the ones absorbing the disruption every single time it flares back up. Every additional round of strikes and counterstrikes chips away a little more at the basic idea that this waterway can function as the predictable, apolitical piece of global infrastructure the entire world's energy trade has quietly depended on for decades. And every day that passes without something resembling a durable resolution increases the odds that some future incident, maybe smaller than this one, maybe considerably larger, ends up being the one that finally collapses the whole fragile arrangement for good, dragging the rest of the global economy down with it, whether it wants to be involved or not. So where does this actually leave the region? And honestly, where does it leave the rest of us watching from thousands of miles away with nothing but headlines and satellite imagery to go on? If you zoom out from the individual strikes, the individual tankers, the individual quotes from officials on both sides, what you're really looking at is a ceasefire that was always more of a pause than a genuine resolution, now being tested in real time by exactly the kind of incident everyone with real expertise in this region quietly worried it wouldn't survive. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't just carry oil and gas. It carries the confidence of an entire global shipping and insurance industry that depends on predictability to function at all, and that confidence has now been shaken twice in the span of a few short weeks. There's also a deeper, far more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, one that goes beyond any single tanker or any single strike package, and it's simply this: what is an American administration actually prepared to accept as the new normal in the Gulf? Are these periodic flare-ups, tanker attacks followed by overwhelming retaliatory strikes, followed by an uneasy, temporary quiet, something Washington is willing to manage indefinitely, treating them as the recurring cost of keeping the strait nominally open for business? Or is there a threshold somewhere down the line at which this repeating pattern tips over into something indistinguishable from a full resumption of the war that supposedly ended back in June? Nobody watching these strikes unfold this week can answer that question with any real confidence, including, I suspect, the people currently sitting inside the Pentagon and the White House, trying to decide what comes next. And that, ultimately, is where this leaves us tonight, with far more questions hanging in the air than answers, and with a timeline that keeps refusing to settle into anything resembling stability, no matter how many ceasefires get signed or ships get struck. Does Iran, still in the middle of burying its supreme leader while absorbing yet another round of American strikes, choose further escalation to satisfy the visible anger boiling over in its own streets? Or does sheer exhaustion, after everything this country has already endured this year, finally outweigh the appetite for revenge among whatever leadership remains standing? Does the ceasefire framework survive a second major breach in a matter of weeks? Or has it already quietly failed in every way that actually matters, with both sides simply too invested in maintaining the fiction of a truce to admit that openly? What happens to global oil markets, and by extension to ordinary people filling up their cars or heating their homes on the other side of the planet, if a third round of tanker attacks hits that strait before this month is even finished? And what does it say about the current state of American foreign policy that a sitting president could be simultaneously reshaping a NATO alliance from a palace in Ankara and authorizing a sweeping wave of strikes against Iran on that very same day, treating both as separate self-contained news items in the same news cycle rather than two threads of one much larger, much more volatile picture unfolding at once? Nobody has clean answers to any of that tonight. What we're left with is smoke drifting over the Strait of Hormuz, a funeral procession still winding its way through the streets of Tehran, oil markets bracing for whatever comes next, and a ceasefire that increasingly looks like it was only ever one bad night away from falling apart completely. Where this actually goes from here, genuinely, honestly, I don't think anyone fully knows yet, and I'm not sure that's a comfortable thing for any of us to sit with, but it's the truth of where we are.